I wanted to produce a follow-up to a video that I made a few weeks ago, and the title of that video was House Bill 7910, Producing Psychopaths. Since I made that video, we have experienced yet another public mass shooting, this time in a suburb of Chicago. As you will recall, House Bill 7910 was all to do with gun regulations, largely as a response to the spate of mass shootings that we have experienced this year. So I wanted to take a look at some of the causation. There's been a lot of commentary out there and speculation as to what on earth could be causing this. And the general sense seems to be that there's an umbrella of mental illness, largely. And this seems to be occurring, and this is my observation, not exclusively, but for the most part, disaffected, heterosexual, white males. So I want you to imagine a scenario for a minute. I'll walk you through a thought experiment. Imagine that there was a large American city. Take your pick. And in this city, there's been a series of particularly heinous crimes occurring. These are break-ins that always involve either a sexual assault or a murder, or both. And they occur at the rate of one every couple of months, sometimes every couple of weeks. And so after a few of them, the police department begins to notice there are some hallmarks to these crimes. And in fact, now the killer is leaving calling cards taunting police. So they know they've got a serial killer on their hands. The FBI would be raining professional profilers on that city immediately. And for decades, we have had profilers that are so good with their detail. Do you recall the images that were drawn of Ted Kaczynski in the hood and the sunglasses? And they even had the chin shape correct somehow. It was unbelievable. Where are the FBI profilers? Where are any profilers? Why is there no speculation there? Why would there be no profiling whatsoever from federal law enforcement? Does that strike you as odd? Profiling would describe who is likely to do this. Once it established that, the next logical question would be why. So I want to take a couple minutes and explore some of the reasons why, because I don't think it's as complicated as people are making it. I think there's another obvious reason why this is not being discussed. So let's talk about that. The reason I would assert to you is because the answer to why this isn't being talked about, why people aren't being profiled, why we aren't talking about specific causation, is because that would be likely to undermine the goals of this administration. If they told the truth about what was motivating these disaffected, young, heterosexual white males to commit these heinous acts, the entire cultural revolution would be undermined. Let me explain. Alienation. We've all experienced it. It isn't pleasant. But how serious is alienation? An African elephant will live 3 times longer in the wild, despite routine risk to its own health and safety, than it would in captivity, where it's pampered and cared for and never has to worry about anything. Why is that? And the answer, one would presume, is because the elephant has been taken out of its natural environment and it's been put into an artificial life support system where people are taking care of it. It does not get to experience the world that it is intuitively designed to interact with because it is a part of. So when you put it in an artificial environment, it has no will, it has no motivation to continue living. It doesn't see any point to it. So let's have a look at the unnatural environment that the radical left has created in the K through 12 schools for kids in those critical first 18 years or so of life. I would assert to you that this can be characterized with three major movements: the imposition of misandry, the imposition of racism, and psychological warfare. And I will explain. Misandry. This has been characterized by an assault on all things male. Toxic masculinity, we're told. Well, don't you know that males have dominated over women and subjugated them and treated them poorly? And this has been the case all throughout history up until 15 minutes ago. And so as a male, you bear a certain responsibility for these ills in the world. It's interesting to note that in the Netherlands and in Germany, they're training kids in elementary school to sit down when they pee. So they're just a bit more radical than we are. An important note at this juncture in history. The second movement, racism. It doesn't matter if you call it good racism, being used to battle against the bad racism of the past, or if you want to call it anti-racism. It's racism. That's what it is. When you look at the world and you first identify people according to their group identity, and then you rank them somewhere in your head. Oh, this is a privileged person. This is an oppressed person. You're the racist. It isn't complicated. You're the racist when you do that. That's what racism is. There is literally no other way to define it or to give a more plain and simple anecdote. The person who sees the world in that way and then makes judgments about people based on their group identity is the racist. How did we ever get away from that? How did we ever forget that that was what characterized a racist or racism? Critical racist theory, which is really just Marxism rebranded, victim, oppressor, instead of the cruel landowners who were greedy in Ukraine during the Holodomor, pitted against the poor farmers who were encouraged to rise up against them and take over the farms in an effort to collectivize them. It's exactly the same. There's nothing clever about it. It's not a particularly interesting maneuver or hard to track or muddy. It's right there where you can see it. The radical left, every major issue for them is defined in terms of victim and oppressor. I mean, it is the fundamental characteristic of Marxism. So psychological warfare would be the third element that kids in K through 12 are being exposed to. And I assert that this is being done with the imposition of transgender ideology. And this actually has nothing to do with people who are transgender. People who are legitimately transgender just happen to end up in the wrong place at the wrong time because you happen to be the perfect social anecdote for the Marxist rebellion that is occurring right now. You just happen to be that perfect blend of confusing gender, appearance, and biology, and what is going on there. And that is something that they should never be forgiven for taking people like that and putting them in the spotlight for their own benefit, to put them up on victim platforms and to shame everyone else for the purpose of elevating themselves above all of us. Shame on them for that. Transgender ideology being pushed on kids in K through 12 includes the imposition of use of gender pronouns upon demand. It includes a false narrative that is told. It includes the move from objective reality to subjective perspective and demands for it. And so this is a type of psychological warfare because it automatically goes against the instincts of children. For all of human history, they've developed into and become what they wanted to be, free of any manipulation or influence of people when they were in those developing years. I don't remember taking a vote on whether or not we should change that or whether that's a good idea or there was a public forum or discussion on it. I don't understand where they think they get the right to just launch this rebellion on the rest of us. But I will take a closer look at that because this is clearly rebranded Marxism. It's government ossification of race hypothesis. Political positions used to be your side of the argument, and from a perspective of we ought to change it and do something different, liberal, or we ought to preserve it and keep it the way that it is, conservative. And now those aren't ideas anymore, or those aren't beliefs that are subject to criticism and possibly changing. Those have been turned into moral positions. So now if I have a disagreement with someone, a political disagreement, they have moralized their position. So it isn't possible for them to concede the argument. It's not possible for them to find a middle ground with me. It's their way or the highway, because to do otherwise would disrupt their religion. This cultural rebellion, I call it, not revolution. A revolution would be when there was a small number of people who were inspiring something that ended up being picked up by the masses. This is exactly the opposite. This is a handful of radicals who have seized power and are using the mass media to distort the message that this is widespread, everyone wants this, why don't you just get on board? Nothing could be further from the truth, and that facade will come down. American colleges and universities are the most keenly aware of how difficult it is to get approval anytime you're doing research involving human subjects. This is a big deal. They will have to get an approval from an institutional review board. They will scrutinize the study. If there's any undue stress or anything unnecessary in there that would cause any sort of issue to the human subjects involved, you will not get approval. Talk to someone who's at a research university right now and ask them about IRB approval and see what they say. My question is this. If you're the institution where you know full well how difficult it is and how serious a matter it is to do experiments on human subjects, then what gave you the idea that you could just assume carte blanche to foist this Marxist social experiment on the rest of us? Because no one asked me for permission, and to my knowledge, no one has any approval, and yet you are beginning to make demands and you are beginning to invert our society. If you haven't noticed, part of the diversity, equity, and inclusion mantra, the net result of that oftentimes is that we are taking the incompetent and the incapable and we are inverting the system. We are putting them in charge of the competent and the capable. I mean, this is backwards land. The mechanism, what they're doing here is they're encouraging students to value their own subjective opinions, conclusions, ideas, and beliefs over those of the whole of society. Objective reality. They cannot win with their defeated arguments. So instead, they have become fascist with language and power. The goal is to destroy the notion of an objective truth and to enable the individual to demand respect for their subjective truth. When you are demanding that when I see you, I must go against my own conscience and use special language modifiers that will shore up and validate your own beliefs about yourself, whether they're objectively true or not. I am required to do that for your benefit, and the expense to me is that I am simultaneously invalidating my own belief system. No, I don't think I'll do that. Thanks. You can try somebody else. I'm not interested in any of that. That is authoritarianism. That is fascism. That is a demand from authority for action with the consequence attached to it. If you are in a university or you work in a large company with an HR department, you know exactly what I'm talking about. When you replace an objective truth with subjective truths. What you have done is you have created a new religion. And I would argue that the unholy trinity of this new religion is the diversity, equity, and inclusion mantra, because it's not what you think it is. So how did we get to this point of word worship with diversity, equity, and inclusion? There's nothing inherently bad about those words. They're generally perceived as good and positive words. So how did they become part of this process to foist Marxism onto American society? When you can effectively deny the most basic elements of fundamental reality, such as male and female, and you can impose that on a society, once you've broken that, everything else will follow. These radicals have designated default features of basic personhood as social constructs. There's nothing vaguely appropriate about that. The notion that gender is simply a fashion and it must now replace any notion of a biological connection to personhood. And however we claim to be or whatever we say we are is what you have to acknowledge that we are, because I mean it's completely, this is upside down land. It doesn't make any sense. And this goes against most people's intuitive sense of what objective reality is without ever having been instructed so or ever having watched a single performance of this theater of social construct that you speak of. So the nauseating mantra of diversity, equity, inclusion, let's go through those definitions. What is diversity? It's the state of being diverse. Variety. Diversity is not our greatest strength, not even close. It's probably our biggest weakness. Overcoming diversity is a great strength of many that we have in this country. But it, in and of itself, is not our greatest strength the way that it's purported. I mean, look around. Overcoming that is something to be recognized and celebrated and supposed as a strength, I guess, of some sort. But diversity itself isn't a strength. That's a silly notion. Equity. What is equity? Equity, freedom from bias or favoritism. Essentially, we're talking about equal outcomes. Sounds to me a little bit like central planning. And finally, inclusion, the action of including or being added within a group. Limitless change to structure. My conclusion is this: the diversity, equity, and inclusion agenda encapsulated is in three parts the following: unlimited variety of all things, central planning, and structural modification without limit. It is a recipe that demands total chaos. The net result of those three things isn't this happy, warm, fuzzy feeling, oh, including people, oh, and they've never had a chance to do this before, and we're finally able to bring them all in. Isn't we're so much stronger now? No, that's not it at all. Not even close. This is unlimited variety, central planning, and structural modifications without limit. That is total chaos. That is total chaos codified. It's right there in front of you. This is a very dangerous new religion. This new religion, ideology, whatever you want to call it, is rooted in and anchored to this fashionable trend in society to demand that other people elevate and respect your subjective opinions about yourself, even if they run counter to objective reality. This is a new religion that makes you God. And with that, I will catch up with you next time. Good luck.